This show is produced by the Hartman Media Company. For more information and links to all our great podcasts, visit hartmanmedia.com.
Welcome to The Holistic Survival Show with Jason Hartman. The economic storm brewing around the world is set to spill into all aspects of our lives. Are you prepared? Where are you going to turn for the critical life skills necessary to survive and prosper? The Holistic Survival Show is your family's insurance for a better life. Jason will teach you to think independently, to understand threats, and how to create the ultimate action plan. Sudden change or worst case scenario, you'll be ready. Welcome to Holistic Survival, your key resource for protecting the people, places, and profits you care about in uncertain times. Ladies and gentlemen, your host, Jason Hartman.
It is my pleasure to introduce Ivor Cummins. He is the author of Eat Rich, Live Long, and that led him down the path of a bigger mission. He was in the corporate world as a complex problem solver. He is a biochemical engineer, and his interest in food and how the food supply has been corrupted led him down the path to really study the elite class and their rather diabolical plans for all of us. I shared the stage with him recently at a conference. I was a speaker on Saturday, and then he spoke on Sunday, and I was just fascinated by his topic, his depth of research, his slides, and so forth. And so we're going to be sharing those visuals. If you're listening on audio only, Ivor will explain to whatever extent possible what he's showing on the screen, but do catch this on our YouTube channel as long as it lasts up there with the powers that be, and you're really going to learn a lot. We are going to do a second interview with him later. Today, we're going to focus on the history because it's just so important that we all see the way this all evolved and became just interwoven in the entire world and is an attempt to exert so much control over the human race. And then in part two that we'll do later, we're going to explore more details and some action steps as to what we can do about it. But today, let's kind of focus on the history. Ivor, welcome. It's good to see you. And you're coming to us from Dublin, Ireland, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Delighted to be here, Jason, and great to meet in Orlando.
It's great to have you. And go ahead and just kind of tee this up for us, and let's take a deep dive in. I'm going to try to not interrupt you too much because I think you've just got so much information here. I want you to get as much out to our audience as possible.
Yeah, great. Well, like you mentioned, I'm a corporate problem-solving guy. I manage very large teams of engineers and other managers worldwide in very complex multi-factor problems. And we hear that, oh, you're not a virologist, you're not a endocrinologist, or all this nonsense. But the problem is we found out over many decades solving problems that the specialized fields can become totally blinkered. And you need a high level, what we call an integrator, to see the full breadth of what's going on and to get into depth in any specific field as required and use the specialists. But you'll never solve a complex problem with specialists. You must have an integrator. So it's kind of funny with the whole world of medicine and health. I spent 10 years getting the messages out and how that really worked, and nutrition, what real nutrition is. And no surprises, it's not what they tell us, because industry has taken over the world of nutrition. And of course, the pharmacology and the big pharma, they've taken over all the training of doctors. So unfortunately, everything we see is highly biased. So I was in that world for 10 years. Then 2020, COVID came along, and it took me a day or two to look up the Diamond Princess cruise ship and actually do a quick mathematical analysis of the impact. And it was like a severe flu, which would affect very elderly people overwhelmingly who had comorbidities. But I was able to tell my wife in March 2020, we don't need masks. We don't need to do a single thing about this. And she said, are you sure? And I said, I am 100% sure. And I also said, my 80-year-old mother, who lives just down the road, she will have essentially no impact beyond the flu from this, because I knew her blood results, and I'm pretty experienced with blood test results. And I knew her health level and her vitamin D level and her insulin sensitivity, without getting into detail. I knew she would not be touched by COVID. And 4 years later, that's proved true also. So I really got into COVID. And then within a couple of months, I began to realize there was something much bigger than the normal corporate corruption that was driving COVID. It was much bigger than swine flu, which was mostly big pharma kind of profiteering. And I began to learn about the World Economic Forum, and I realized, oh no, this is a half century long kind of plan that's now breaking on our shores. So that's what I spent the time on, to understand the geopolitical history. And if you understand the history, you are inoculated forever from all the nonsense and propaganda they can throw at you. If you understand the history, you are tungsten carbide.
Yeah. I love the meme. Sometimes these little memes that are going around contain so much truth in such a small message. One that's going around is, whenever I'm not feeling good about myself, I have to realize that over $1 trillion of propaganda didn't work on me.
Yes.
I love that one. And
Perfect.
they were able to withstand over $1 trillion of propaganda. So take us into the whole thing, and please share your screen and let's look at this, because you've got some great visuals, and do try and explain those to the people who are audio only to whatever extent possible.
Okay, I'll give it a shot. So I'm just sharing the first slide now. This is the New York Times in September 2020. And I was getting a lot of reach. I wasn't too heavily censored because I always referenced everything I said with published papers or government data. But then I got too popular and I put out a viral video. It got 2 million views in a week. And the New York Times did a hit job on me, an Irish engineer. And they spent a half a page saying how he's not correct, he's not an expert. But the funny thing was, Jason, a year or two later, when all the data was in, I checked every aspect of my video and the article that I'm showing now. And as it happened, not being smart, I was correct on every single vector, of course. But because I so effectively, with references and graphs and published data, I so effectively destroyed the viral narrative, the COVID narrative, that's why the New York Times did a half-page article on an Irish engineer. So just show you the power of the system. The phones, started buzzing, and the New York Times was told, you gotta get this guy. It doesn't matter who it is, how small he is, because CEOs of significant corporations were beginning to ask the experts, is this Irish guy right? Because he seems very convincing. So they did a hit job, and then the next day, YouTube took down around 16 of my videos, put me on a double strike. So I was chastised for telling the truth.
Yeah.
And then I knew beyond all doubt, I knew already.
Yeah.
I knew that it sadly was a, quote, conspiracy, because that simply wouldn't happen in a real world.
Yeah. And as I've said for easily 15 years right here on this show, just go listen to my old interviews, folks. Many of you have. There are conspiracies all around us all the time. Anybody who doesn't believe that is a conspiracy theorist themselves. This whole idea of making this can be considered some sort of wacky, outlandish thing. I mean, a conspiracy is just two or more people planning something in secret. Right. I mean, of course, that happens every moment of every day all around the world. Right. It's not a big deal. And I would submit to you that the United States of America was a conspiracy. Okay. That's how it started, as a conspiracy against the British Crown. So, if you don't believe in conspiracy theories, you're just an idiot. I'm sorry. I mean, of course, there are conspiracy theories and conspiracy facts. Well, let's just put that on the table to start.
Yeah, absolutely. And conspire just means to breathe together.
Yeah.
And it just means people get together relatively secretly, but not necessarily secretly.
Yeah.
A lot of these guys publish everything, like the Rockefeller Archives and WEF. They're even smarter. They publish everything theoretically, but no media covers it. So they make sure they're not too secret, because they know it's not going to be covered, so they can actually say it and go on the record and still do it.
One of the other things, so that's their out to say, look, this is not a secret. We publish this. You can just look on our website. I mean, a lot of this stuff is right there out in the open. But again, the media doesn't pick it up. So it's there. They can use it to defend. But again, it's not published widely. And the other part of it is that, like anybody, it's just part of human nature. If there's a group that is doing something and they consider what they're doing to be an accomplishment, right, which that's what they get up and do every day, they want to show their accomplishments off. They want to brag about them. So they drop in little hints here and there, symbolism, all sorts of funny things, So this stuff really isn't that much of a secret, as you said. But okay, go ahead.
Yeah, very good. So I'm just going to the next slide. I show the text of the New York Times, and I I mean, I'm going to frame it. It's just so beautiful because everything they said was nonsense, of course. And that video with all the facts was correct. But it did bring me on to the World Economic Forum, which is a very important organization. And some people think, oh, it's a talk shop in Davos and they go in private jets and they bring in presidents and leaders, but they're just talking. But that's not true. That's naive. The World Economic Forum, I'll briefly mention where it came from. It came from the loins of Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And they clearly set out they wanted a world government dominated by the West. And they worked with the State Department, and even the CIA were funding their conferences. So this is not small time. This is the richest family in America in bed with the State Department and basically planning American dominance and in a world government. The opposite of a conspiracy theory. And you could even say, to our earlier point, it wasn't really hidden, as I'll show you. They kind of documented everything, but they always use kind of fancy language about saving granny and improving the state of the world. And that language covers them. They kind of say what they're going to do, but they put it in language that makes it sound good, which is the oldest trick in the book. And I'm going to skip that joke there and go to Benito Mussolini. I'm a World War II buff. I've watched thousands of hours of documentaries. I'm just into it. But Mussolini, I knew for many, many years. He defined fascism properly, and it's very important to know the definition. It should be rightly called corporatism, as it is a merger of corporate and government power. That is the definition of fascism. So we're all told, oh, you're against immigration, you're a fascist. Nonsense. Oh, you know, you're against masking, you're a fascist. Completely absurd. Fascism is the merger of government and corporate power. And that's what National Socialism was in Germany with that nasty man, Adolf, and all the other regimes. They joined the means of production and the corporate and the wealthy with the government, and they made a totalitarian system. Once you understand that, you realize they're selling us fascism. You know, it's important. And Mussolini also said for the fascist, everything is the state. Now, is the state or is the corporate power, is the WEF? It doesn't matter. Everything is the collective power broker. And nothing human or spiritual exists, much less as value, outside the state. In this sense, fascism is totalitarian. And that's another key thing. Communism, fascism, they're all just forms of totalitarianism.
Right.
It's where the state or the corporate or the elite run the system and the people are ants in an ant farm.
Yep.
They're all the same. Communism, fascism, they debate. Oh, the new regimes in the world today, they're like communism, socialism. Oh, they're like fascism. It's all BS. Communism, fascism, as Ayn Rand said, they're basically just thugs fighting over the same turf.
Exactly.
It's all totalitarianism.
You know, it's very interesting. I'm glad you brought up Mussolini because I have studied him a fair bit, and I think history does not give him enough attention because what we've got now is we have these iron triangles in society that are the corporatocracy, the state, and, you know, the special interest lobbyists, right? They cannot be broken, it seems. Why would a group called Antifa exist to say that the people who want freedom, that don't want to be controlled, that don't want the big pharma companies and the state to be in bed together, how are they the fascists? They're the complete opposite, you know. But interestingly, you mentioned Ayn Rand, and I've studied Ayn Rand extensively, and she's sort of hard to pin down because, interestingly, she called the libertarians the hippies of the left in a derogatory, or the hippies of the right, sorry, in a derogatory way. So it's sort of hard to pin Ayn Rand down, you know, to say she's an objectivist. But yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I mean, Ayn Rand, she came out with some great quotes and she largely had it correct. I wasn't actually aware of that libertarian kind of slur.
Yeah, the hippies of the right. Yeah.
The hippies of the right. I can kind of see her logic in some ways, some of them,
too.
but I think it was misplaced.
Yeah.
And, you know, but the key thing is that Rockefeller and the Rockefellers basically were very smart. Their father was the psychopath, John D. Rockefeller of Standard Oil, and he indoctrinated his 5 sons in the key vision of the family. And it was not to do with making more money because they had more money than he could ever spend. It was about them taking their destiny and leading the creation of a world government, the ultimate world government. And that's what they were born and bred for. And the Rockefeller Brothers Fund in the 50s essentially set in motion everything that leads us to where we are today. And Dr. Nordengard, Jakob Nordengard in Sweden, I owe a huge debt to because I knew a lot of this. But in 2022, I discovered his lectures. He did a PhD on the Rockefellers in 2012. And the Rockefeller lawyers tried to stop it getting published. And they couldn't. The professors backed Nordengard. It was all factual. It was all reference to the Rockefeller archives and published sources. And they failed. And he published it. And he wrote a book I'm showing on the screen now, Rockefeller Controlling the Game. And basically, that book is astonishing. And it filled in all the gaps I had. All the climate change nonsense, the COVID, the pharma stuff, the geopolitics. That book basically explains not just that the Rockefellers controlled the whole game for the last 70 years, but they needed massive amounts of allies. They needed allies in Harvard, the State Department, CIA, huge amounts of organizations, UN, WHO, which they helped set up. They donated the buildings, 1946, and the money. And the Club of Rome, climate catastrophe propaganda group of rich guys, Bilderberg. They're all the same guys, and they're all going for a world government, which, needless to say, Jason, they talk in lovely terms about 15-minute cities and sustainability, but it's all BS. What it is a perfect, as my daughter said in 2020, they want an ant farm, don't they? And I said, that's exactly it. They want a nice managed ant farm in the West. China already has pretty much a nice managed ant farm, and they want to be able to deal like with China, ant farm to ant farm, ant leaders to ant leaders.
Let me just elaborate on what you're saying a moment. Starting about maybe 15 years ago on this show, we did some episodes about UN Agenda 21. And everybody needs to understand that under the guise of the environment, right? Look, green trees have red roots, as they say, right? In communism, in other words. And under the guise of the environment, the kind of control and the kind of con they can persuade us all into is amazing. Of course, we're all in favor of a good environment, right? Nobody wants a bad environment, except maybe the warmongers who are destroying the environment with their wars. That's you, Joe Biden, by the way. But 15-minute cities, UN Agenda 21, right? If you corral most of the population into small spaces and make them dependent on the system rather than being on the farm in rural areas, growing their own food, self-sustained, they are dependent on the system, and then the elites have control of them. It's a much easier way for them to gain control over people, is to corral them.
It's the perfect way. And actually, that's why I always acknowledge the opponents are smart. I don't think they'll win ultimately, and we can talk in the next chat about the pushback. But at the end of the day, it's a smart strategy, and I'm not surprised they picked it. Give people hobgoblins, made up fears of climate disaster and population explosion, give them plenty of fear, and then say, we can save you from these hobgoblins. We can save you from this fear. Problem, reaction, solution. And Rockefeller, it's funny, in the 50s, they identified climate disaster, pandemics, and global financial crashes. What was the other one? I think macro terrorism. They actually pre-identified the opportunities, the narratives that would help them convince the people to go with their new world government. But they identified those, including pandemics and climate crisis, with no scientists in the room. So I think it's important to understand, or people to understand, if something like climate crisis and pandemic nonsense is identified by ultra-rich sociopaths with no scientist presence, and then they fund scientists for the next half century to go along with those stories, what's the chances that those stories are actually real scientifically? And the answer, Jason, is zero, right? You know that. It's common sense.
Right. And let me mention something else that's complete common sense. I mean, folks, this is so basic and so obvious. Everybody listening or watching knows that you can buy off a politician. That's what the whole field of being a lobbyist is all about. It's about trading favors and crony capitalism and money in brown paper bags, or, here's some land I'm developing, or hey, Nancy Pelosi, I'm a CEO of this public company, and maybe you should buy some stock right now because we're about to do something that nobody knows about. I mean, it's endless the amount of favoritism and cronyism that goes on. Well, if you can buy off a politician, and everybody knows you can, everybody knows politicians are all sponsored, just like Formula One cars in a race. Okay, it's just no different. Why would you think that you can't buy off a scientist or entire scientific companies or communities or associations? Of course you can. Who sponsors the conferences? Who pays for the golf tournaments? This is done with pharma. I mean, there's so much evidence of this. It's just ridiculous amount of influence peddling.
Yeah, at this stage, it's a parody of itself. I mean, the scientists that came out promoting seed oils, which we know are factory kind of concocted chemical compounds, which are terrible for health. They're inflammatory. But they bought the science on that, so we all eat our heart-healthy seed oils or vegetable oils. And they told us that meat, fish, and eggs, which we evolved on, we literally, Homo sapiens, came from that. They've told us for 40 or 50 years, they're bad for us. So like you say, Jason, it's comical. It's so easy to buy the scientists. And recently I came across an example that...
And they told us fat was bad. and sugar and fake sugar, even worse, is good.
Of course.
It's
insane. This is how they work. And
all you have to do to know this is true is just, if you're old enough, just remember what people used to look like in the 70s and 80s and look at them today. Everybody's overweight. Everybody's unhealthy. It's insane. They have poisoned the United States for sure, and most of the world as well. It's just pathetic what these people have done.
Yeah, and almost gleefully. I mean, they literally have zero conscience. They don't.
Hey, why would you? You have the diabetes industrial complex, the cancer industrial complex, the vaccine industrial complex. I mean, the mental health and SSRI industrial complex. There's so much money to be made here.
It's a feeding frenzy. And at this stage, the only reason people aren't utterly rebelling like they did against John D. Rockefeller in the 1900s, the only reason is these guys were smart enough to pretty much buy up the media. So the media feed a pipeline of utter propaganda 24/7 to the people. And we all saw it during COVID. It became comical. Round the clock talk about basically a bad flu rebranded as the bubonic plague. And a lot of people said, hold on a minute, I don't know anyone who died. And I don't really know anyone who was very sick, but the television is telling me every day that this is Armageddon. So a lot of people said, hold on a minute. But after a couple of months of round-the-clock propaganda, most humans actually reset their frame of reference. It's a psychological trick that humans do. If they're out of step with their tribe, even if they're convinced the tribe is wrong, if all the experts keep saying X, after a while it becomes very uncomfortable, and they psychologically just say, well, okay, I accept X. And then they just roll. And that's what happened in COVID. It's old psychology.
Yeah, it isn't amazing to everybody. Try and remember the end of COVID, right? Try and remember when that happened, right? I remember about when it happened. And I remember that I had Peter Zion on the show. He's been on many times. He's the geopolitical guy. He's written lots of interesting books. At the start of our last interview, he said, well, when everyone decided COVID was over, that's what he said. Like, it was just a decision people made. Yeah. They wanted to move on with their lives. And funny thing, that was pretty much true.
Yeah. I mean, people were sick of it. Someone up the top decided, okay, people are beginning to really get sick of COVID. They're beginning to really question the whole bloody thing. We'd better quit while we're ahead. But then, of course, immediately they slotted in Ukraine. And then we had a year of propaganda on Ukraine. And basically, even though in 2014 there was the CIA-connected coup, they got rid of the elected Russian-favoring president, and they brought in the scumbag Zelensky. I mean, even though that was all technically on the record, everyone forgot it. And they all, Mr. Putin bad, Orange Man bad. I mean, this is the problem with the ownership of the media. You can brainwash otherwise smart people to strenuously believe any nonsense. It is quite scary what they can do with their media ownership.
Yeah. Well, not to mention the tech companies, but go ahead.
Oh, shocking. But Rockefeller Special Studies Project, the 5 Rockefeller brothers got together, an absolute ton of money. Nelson Rockefeller, who went on to be the vice president, these are big connected guys. And they brought in Henry Kissinger because they identified him as being a really useful individual. And he proved to be. I mean, look at Kissinger's career. He's Rockefeller's boy. And they said we cannot escape and indeed should welcome the task which history has imposed on us. They got all this from John Dee, the father. This is the task of helping to shape a new world order in all its dimensions, spiritual, economic, political, social. So you can see here the sheer fascism, right? They're nice words, but these guys are not holding back. They want to reshape the whole world, a new world order. And this was printed, but the media didn't obviously comment and say, hold on, who are these turkeys? Because the media were bought. But their challenge, they said, was to build a new world structure which will make possible the fulfillment of the basic purposes of humanity. So now you're talking about ultra-rich children of Big Daddy Oil Man are deciding they're going to build a new world order to make possible the fulfillment of the basic purposes of humanity. Now, that should tell you in retrospect that these guys are sick in the head. But the problem is, and I'll mention it shortly, they had the Trilateral Commission, the League of Nations, then the United Nations, and they had all these organizations that the world's leaders were part of. So unfortunately, these sociopaths had access to all of the world's leaders and had massive influence. And that was the problem. If they were just ordinary people with ordinary funding, maybe they'd torture some small animals or maybe even kill someone in a diner, and that'd be the end of it. But unfortunately, these guys had so much money and influence, well, that here we are. And I just reminded there in the slide for people who are listening, for the fascist, everything is the state. Nothing human or spiritual exists, much less has value outside the state. It's totalitarianism. That was Mussolini. And this is what they are saying in nice words. They want a totalitarian world order. And really quickly, Council of Foreign Relations, immensely powerful organization with all the who's who of presidents and world leaders and influencers in it. David Rockefeller from 1970 to 85, in the most critical period, was the chair of that. And they identified in the 70s global health, climate, human resources, resources of the world as opportunities, because they very cleverly realized if we're going to get a global new world order, we need to convince the people to get behind this global totalitarianism. So we're obviously going to need global hobgoblins and scare stories that are global in order to get people scared enough to say yes. And they identified pandemics, climate disaster, population bomb, and peak oil as opportunities before the scientists got on board. They already identified all the stuff we have to listen to painfully today on a whiteboard in a corporate back room.
So peak oil, the big theory from the 70s, that never happened. The complete opposite happened, to where we had massive amounts of oil, thanks to technology, being able to extract it. And then Al Gore, in his younger days, he was running around scaring people about the coming ice age.
Yeah. It's so funny. Time magazine featured that. You see, what happened is, the temperature was naturally rising from the 1800s up to the 50s. And that's just natural. It's coming out of the little ice age. And it's a natural phenomenon. It's based on the Malkovich cycles, or not Malkovich. Oh, I forget the pronunciation. And the sun and, solar energy and cosmic rays even, and the position of the Earth in our solar system. So there's all these factors that define the average temperature. That's just nature. But the temperature was rising. They got excited about global warming, figuring they could put a narrative onto it, like rain dance men or snake oil salesmen. But then in the 60s and 70s, naturally, even though the CO2 was going through the roof, the temperature naturally leveled off and flattened. And the scientists began to talk about potentially an increase in the ice age type challenge. And everyone went with it, including Time magazine. And I'm sure Rockefeller and all the rest of the guys were saying, oh, this is awkward. So they were quite quiet during the 70s and 80s because they don't know jack about science. So they're thinking, oh, this has ruined our narrative. And then later, the temperature began to tick up again naturally. And then they got back on plan. So they're not scientifically that knowledgeable. So they're just looking for an opportunity to take what's happening naturally and stick a narrative on it. That's all that happened.
Yeah, absolutely. Never let a good crisis go to waste. And it wasn't even a
Yes.
crisis, but they created a crisis where none existed. I've recommended this book many times on the show over the years, folks, and I would highly recommend it again. It's called The Bet. It's about Paul Ehrlich and Julian Simon and the gamble over Earth's future. And the author of The Bet, Paul Sabin, chronicles all of their media and all of the attention these two got battling it out about, Malthusian ideas that the population was going to destroy the world, and Ehrlich, and what he said and what Julian Simon said, and you just know what was right. I mean, the prediction from the environmental left was that we would have this massive scarcity, famine. In fact, they said people ought to stop effing. In other words, they didn't want to have any more kids, no more people, right? Because people are the scourge of the earth. And the complete opposite has happened. We have more abundance than ever. I mean, we have more food than ever. We have too much food. we have more abundance in every imaginable way. So again, it's amazing they can keep up with these narratives because they just keep losing. Like, anybody looking at this stuff objectively knows that their predictions have just been false, wrong. It's amazing, this alarmism. It just has been proven false so many times.
Well, absolutely, Jason. But the problem is the average man or woman in the street who's reading the media does not really get to see the obvious reality. They get fed the narrative, and as a result, they are deluded, just like we saw in COVID, people wearing masks in the car. I mean, how did that happen? It's absurd. But they know that, I mean, Goebbels, I think it was attributed to in National Socialist Germany back in the war, said, give me control of the media or the radio, and I'll turn any nation into a nation of pigs. So they knew the power. If we hold the megaphone, we can just make black white, up, down. We can do anything with humans. And that's the sad reality. Now, these guys set up the Harvard International Seminar, and in conjunction with the Council of Foreign Relations and all the other influencers, they pulled together the who's who of world influencers. And it was funded by Ford Foundation and Rockefeller Foundation, of course. And it later transpired that the CIA had funded it too, which, of course, the State Department is going to have to be up to their neck in a future world government plan. So that's not a conspiracy theory. That makes sense. They identified Klaus Schwab, that we all know and love now, the WEF. But people need to understand that the Harvard seminar and Rockefellers created the WEF as a tool, right? They called it the European Management Forum in 1971. They identified the sociopath Klaus Schwab, like they identified Kissinger, and they said, hey, we can use you. You run the European Economic Forum. And in the 80s, it became the World Economic Forum. But, I mean, they simply create all these organs of control that they require to push their plan. No conspiracy theory. It's corporate dominance of the sphere. That's all it is. And Barbara Ward, who set up the European Management Forum, one of the board, she was banging on about sustainable development because, of course, they realized, how do we get the people to worry about the future and to need us to help them? Well, we have to start talking about a future where the planet's in trouble and their children will be in trouble. Sustainability. So that became a centerpiece of World Economic Forum. Not economics, sustainability. And essentially, I'll finish with this, just absolutely, Jason, let you back in. But jump forward to today, World Economic Forum partners. These are only the primary funding partners out of around 400 corporates. But it just shows you now, you've got Ericsson, Goldman Sachs, Intel, Microsoft, IBM, JP Morgan, Citibank, MasterCard, Visa, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Open Society for Soros, Amazon, ABB, Chevron, Oil Money. That's just a handful of the top funding partners, right? The banks, big oil, and big pharma, they're up to their neck in it. And the last slide I'll touch on, I went to their website, still there, I think, but I made sure I captured it. And I'm just showing on the screen now all the corporations who are funding partners. And it's basically every big corporation.
Funding partners of the WEF, the World Economic Forum. Right.
Yeah. And remember Mussolini, and this is crucial, fascism is corporatism. It is the unifying of corporate and government power. You're looking at it. World Economic Forum is funded by all the major corporates, hundreds. And that is by definition fascism if they get in bed with government and influence policy. Guess what? They're not just influencing policy, they're managing to carry off pandemics. They're carrying off world pandemic treaties. They're carrying off a move to 15-minute cities. So the corporate kind of head of the snake is basically beginning to become the government. And I think increasingly, I don't know what you think, Jason, but there's a phrase came out recently, puppeticians. And in Ireland, for sure, clear as crystal in the last few years, our politicians are puppeticians. Overwhelmingly, they implement WEF, UN, EU policy, and they literally urinate on what the voters want. Every time what the voters want comes up in polls, the government do the opposite. They are clearly reporting up to the corporate mothership.
Yeah, it's truly unbelievable. And, you know, we had Vivek Ramaswamy, the presidential candidate, on the show a while back. And he, of course, wrote the book Woke Inc., which is an interesting parallel to everything you're saying, because all of these same corporations are on board with this whole ideology that just distracts from all the evil stuff they're doing, all the pollution they're causing, all of these sweatshops they're running. It's just a total distraction. It's the ultimate fake virtue signaling. It's truly incredible. It really, really is. I got another meme for you. Okay, and maybe I'll get this on the screen. But this one, I just took a screenshot on my phone yesterday, and it's a picture of good old Bill Gates, okay? And it says, when a guy has enough money to end world hunger, end poverty, regenerate the soil, and clean the oceans, and instead he chooses to pump his money into GMO mosquitoes, blocking out the sun, you know, because they're concerned about the warming, right? Creating fake meat, and most importantly, producing toxic vaccines for 7 billion people, you have to ask yourself, why? Why is that where his attention goes? Why is that where his money goes? It's just shocking.
It is, Jason, and it is a frustration for me, to be honest, that I have very educated friends in senior positions who semi-cancelled me, and now actually they're kind of dawning on them that I was correct on everything, but I don't care. I'm fine with being cancelled. But because they're in senior positions and they're reading the newspaper of record on their desks every morning, it's practically ironed and put on their desk, and they're watching the main TV channels, you know, the official government ones. Their heads are so full of propaganda, they really cannot believe that it's all utter nonsense. But slowly they're beginning to realize, and there's an awakening happening. But you're right, that Gates thing. I mean, one guy commented way back, it was so funny. Gates was brought to the Supreme Court for megalomania in the antitrust action.
Right, in the 90s.
Footage shows him nodding rhythmically. And just watch him, and you would say, I don't want that guy near anything that influences anything.
And he's referring to the Bill Gates deposition, which went very badly when he was being deposed in the Microsoft antitrust case over the forced use of their lousy browser. It's just truly unbelievable. What we have to realize is these people are basically criminals who have gotten away with their crimes. And if you get big enough, you can buy virtue. And that's what they're doing, right? But, you know, for those who think like, you know, this is an outlandish conspiracy theory or something like that, look, this is really not a big deal. I mean, since the beginning of time, the people with more power or more money or more influence or more physical strength, they used their resources to have more influence. I mean, there's nothing new here. This has happened since the beginning of the time. I mean, grow up. Is it any surprise that, you know, Klaus Schwab and the Bidens and the Bushes and all of the central figures of our world are using their power? I mean, does that surprise anybody? It shouldn't.
Exactly. And that's the key point. And I often say in my interviews that humanity has gone through cycles into totalitarianism and, you know, despots and terrible times driven by the elite few and suffered greatly. And then at some point they rebel. And then you get an egalitarian, kind of fair society and everyone's happy. But then they get soft and they think everything's fine. And they forget there's a percentage of humanity who are always striving to get to the top and run an ant farm. So what happens is you end up back in totalitarianism.
Yep.
And this has happened
The
in
cycle.
cycles forever, forever.
Right.
From the Roman Empire, Shaku Zulu in Africa. Doesn't matter where in the world, humans are humans. So we now have gone through a huge softening since World War II. And now the people after 3 generations out of World War II, especially with phones and all the modern luxuries we have in the West, they've become soft as puppy poo, basically. And as a result, they're absolutely ripe to be taken over by the hard guys, the totalitarians like Schwab and the Rockefellers. It's inevitable. So now we're going into this fourth turning and we're heading into totalitarianism. And, you know, we'll come through that in coming decades and we'll get back to egalitarian good societies. But we're going to have to go through the fire.
Here's the problem, though. Here's the problem. The longer we allow these power grabs to happen, and the more power they grab, the harder the struggle to get out of it. You know, one of the things that made the U.S. so great is the checks and balances of the 3 branches of government. And before those were all co-opted like they are now, largely, you really could run a pretty balanced society as long as you had a large middle class and this whole idea of, you know, rugged individualism and all the things that made the U.S. the sort of beacon of freedom for the world. But, you know, sadly, it's been turning the other way for quite a while, certainly since the 60s. I would say that was a big part of it. And if you read any of Saifedean Ammos's work, he wrote the Bitcoin standard and he wrote the fiat standard and then, you know, fiat food, which you'd be interested in, right? Mm-hmm. And, you know, we've got all of these sort of fiat things, and that word fiat just means by authority, by decree, right? It's valuable because we said it's going to be, right? And these are all fake. They're not real. Right. And they can con all of us for a while as long as people will play the game. But at some point, the jig is up and it's up on everything. You know, we're being poisoned with the fiat food. The fiat money is inflating away everybody's wealth. It's destroying the middle class. It's concentrating wealth because of the Cantillon effect into the small elite class. It's really scary stuff. So what's your advice as we wrap it up today? I know we're going to do a whole nother session about what you can do about it, but maybe just give us a sliver of hope here before you go today.
Well, yeah, the thing is that, and absolutely what you just said, Jason, I mean, because of technology, I think that this cycle, even though there have been many, I think the guys at the top in this cycle reckon with massive technology, surveillance, like I think China now has a really good ant farm and it's almost impossible to rebel because they have 350 million cameras.
Even in Hong Kong, it's impossible to rebel, which is crazy, you know? And 2 of the British judges just resigned in Hong Kong because you can't defeat the power of the CCP. They're just too powerful. Yeah,
and I mean, there's a great case in point. I'll say a negative story now, and then we'll finish with a positive one, absolutely. But around a few months ago, China, they do allow their citizens to peacefully hold up placards outside a business who has mistreated them. They allow a little bit of steam to release. But there was a bank that froze millions of dollars in Chinese businessmen's assets. I'm not sure the details, but the government must have been in support because a bunch of businessmen agreed on a Friday to go to the local town and to protest peacefully about this freezing of accounts. Mm-hmm. And on Friday night, all their phones went COVID red and they could not move. So technology can be used to snuff out rebellion almost before it starts. And I think this current kind of variant, COVID variants, this current variant of totalitarians that have got together with the Rockefeller Brothers up till today and all their clubs like, you know, Bilderberg and all them, WEF, I think they reckon, they always talk about technology, they reckon we'll make it stick. You remember Hitler said 1,000-year Reich? Well, he got beaten and he didn't have any 1,000-year Reich. He ended up committing suicide in the bunker. Yeah. But I think these guys reckon, hey, we can maybe have 1,000-year Reich, because technology will stop the ants rebelling. So that's the negative note. And they've got a point, but I don't think it's going to work. The positive note is there was the Road to Geneva march just last weekend when we were in Orlando at the conference. Buses and people from all over Europe went to Geneva to highlight the UN and the WHO pandemic treaty. enough is enough. We have freedom groups all over the world now gaining huge support, from RFK through to all the other medical freedom groups, and then all the legal people who are fighting against the EU communisto system. And we have a public awareness, I think. So in Ireland recently, it was a very important moment. They tried to change our constitution, which protected women and mothers and families. And the wording, I'm honest with you, Jason, the wording wasn't like old-fashioned. It was written 100 years ago. The wording could have been written yesterday. It was perfectly good that because the state is dependent on the health of the family, and the family is society, the state will absolutely strive that no mother has to, through economic hardship, leave the children behind to work out of hardship. Not that the state wants the woman in the house, but the state must help a woman who would leave and abandon the kids due to economic hardship. This is perfect. This is perfectly sensible, right? But the government tried to bring in changes based on NGO lobbying and, of course, the UN and WEF, all those guys. And they wanted to take all that protection of the family out of the Constitution and put in that we respect any durable relationship. Durable relationships. So replace the family, marriage, the whole of society with any durable relationship. So it's clearly rotten. Now, the interesting thing was the government, all the government politicians were screaming for a yes vote to get this disgraceful change through. All the NGOs were screaming for it. And all of our mainstream media were screaming for a yes. So you'd say, well, if everyone and all the experts are saying yes, probably the sheeple voted yes, but they didn't. We got the biggest no vote in the history of referendums in Ireland. So the people now do not understand what we're saying. Most of them don't know what is wrong, but they know something's really wrong.
Right. Yeah.
That's a start. And they threw it back. And a whole load of politicians, including our prime minister, effectively, left office in the next couple of weeks. So there's big awareness happening.
Yeah. And you're calling politicians puppeticians, like puppets, you mean, when you say that? I just want to clarify
absolutely.
that. Yeah.
I didn't make up that phrase, but Jason, I love it. Puppeticians.
Oh, no, it's a great way.
There's so few genuine statesmen or stateswomen. Overwhelmingly, they're butt puppets of the UN, WEF, EU. I mean, they just take their orders from the top on all issues.
They should be forced to wear patches on their suits that show who their sponsors are. That should be a required disclosure. I mean, look, when you see a race car driver in his uniform, it's got the logos of all the companies that sponsor him, right? That's how politicians should be. They should be forced to do the same thing. Yeah,
absolutely.
It's something else. All right. Well, Ivor, thank you for this great education. I'm really looking forward to part 2 with you, and it's going to be great. So we will get that scheduled and we'll get it out to you here in the near future, folks. Give out your website or whatever resources you want to share with people, social media, whatever it is, wherever you haven't been deplatformed yet.
Well, actually, because I reference everything I've said, and even with the New York Times attacking me on YouTube, I'm still on all the platforms, which is quite amazing. I was off LinkedIn for a year and a half for doing a funny video, personal video with my voiceover about Tony Blair. It wasn't even against the COVID regulations. So it just shows you the corruption. But I'd say just Google my name, Ivor Cummins. My YouTube and my Twitter I'm most active on rather than my website. And I think the links to my Vimeo of the 2 talks I gave in Dubai last month will give people a great, more deeper overview of all of this stuff.
Okay, excellent. Sounds good. Well, Ivor, thank you for joining us. You can be followed on X, one of the last free speech platforms, and then all the other places you mentioned as well. Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any episodes. Be sure to check out the show's specific website and our general website, hartmanmedia.com, for appropriate disclaimers and terms of service. Remember that guest opinions are their own, and if you require specific legal or tax advice or advice in any other specialized area, please consult an appropriate professional. And we also very much appreciate you reviewing the show. Please go go to iTunes or Stitcher Radio or whatever platform you're using and write a review for the show. We would very much appreciate that. And be sure to make it official and subscribe so you do not miss any episodes. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode.